Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar. We are going to be getting started in just a few minutes. We're just waiting for everyone else to hop on into the webinar. Just sit tight and we'll get started soon. All right, once again, thank you so much to everyone who is joining us here for today's webinar. We're really excited to get started and excited to have you here. I am going to go ahead and kick this over to our presenter today, Susan Lambert, who is the Vice President of CKLA. Susan, you want to take over?
Thanks so much, Madison. Thanks everybody for joining. Good afternoon where you are, and we are really excited that you are able to join us today. Just a couple of logistics I'd like to get out of the way before we start. We are going to be doing a question and answer at the end, and so there's a little box on the right hand side of your screen that says questions. So any questions you have in there, please put them in that box. I have Madison and Julia there monitoring those questions so we can take care of them at the end. And then if you're having any issues, either technical issues, there's also a chat box that you can utilize during the presentation today. We are recording, just so that you know, and this recording will be made available afterwards in case you aren't able to stay for the whole thing or if you're having technical issues. So I am just going to say hello again. My name is Susan Lambert. I'm the Vice President on the elementary ELA side at Amplify. I will say apologies if I sneeze or cough. I've picked up a little bit of a cold and I'm hoping it's not going to impact our webinar today, but I am very glad to have you join us. As a matter of introduction, I am a former teacher, so I did most of my teaching in grades 3, some in 5th grade classrooms. I did a 1-2 split at one time, and have also been a principal, director of curriculum, and I've been in the public school world, I've been in the international private school world, as well as in the charter world, and it's just really my pleasure to be here with Amplify now to just make an impact on kids across the nation. And so when I'm not doing that, then I'm doing some other kind of adventuring, maybe a little bit like riding on the Thunderbolt, but just a little bit about me. Today's agenda, let's frame some things up first. We're going to talk about 3 really important pillars about why knowledge matters, why we need to have equity and access for our students in English language arts, and the importance of engaged learners. And then again, we're going to save some time at the end for some question and answer. So let's start the framing, and I wish we could frame this with some better news, but literacy instruction across the country is having very little impact in terms of students' outcomes. We know that about 34% of the students that enter kindergarten really lack the basic skills they need to learn how to read. And we're not helping them out because you can see that 63% of all fourth graders read below grade level. So that's significant and frightening given what we know about what works in reading instruction. And then, to just sort of follow that thread through, when we look at those students that graduate from high school, only 37% of them are at or above the reading proficiency. So, we don't make much progress with our students, and that's really frightening. Again, just another trend we have here across the country, and this is the fourth grade NAEP reading results. And you can see that over time, we've made very little impact in terms of how proficient our students are. And the story isn't that much better in 8th grade, right? Pretty flat line from where we started in 1992 all the way up to 2017 with the release of the latest results. And the thing is we'll talk a little bit later in this webinar about what we know about reading research, because we actually know a whole lot. It's one of the most studied topics in education is how kids learn how to read. I think we're going to be talking just a little bit about program materials and the importance of high quality materials. And I know as a former practitioner that publishers and programs just try to be everything to everyone, that within the program materials you have multiple paths to success and multiple ways to support, and the same program can be used very differently in classrooms that are just next door to each other. We've all heard this jack of all trades and master of none, and I sort of feel like that's where we are with our instructional materials. Some of you may know who Napoleon Hill is. He's actually one of the first authors of self-help books. And what he said was, the jack of all trades isn't really good for anything at all. What we want to be able to do is concentrate our efforts on one definitive chief aim. And here today with Amplify, we're going to talk about that chief aim and what our focus is as it relates to literacy. Some of you may know Amplify from our all green ratings in science. That's not reflected in this slide, but know that our science materials are top rated by EdReports. They're actually the only science materials that are all green. And similarly, we have this with our ELA materials. So Amplify CKLA, our K through 5 program, Amplify ELA, our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade program, is all green in all of these gateways. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk through the importance of these gateways and what it means to be all green in those ratings. So EdReports does a very thorough job reviewing with a rubric program materials in order to get to these particular scores. And the first two gateways, this idea of text quality and building knowledge, they review all programs on those two gateways. We're going to talk about what text quality means. It's this idea that students should be engaged in increasingly more complex and rigorous texts, and this idea that the program materials should allow students to build background knowledge or build knowledge coherently along with associated vocabulary. If your program actually passes those two gateways with all green, then they go on to look at usability. And usability isn't just how easy is it for the teachers to use, which is important as well, but also how well do the program materials help support student learning at all different levels. So are there within the program materials ways to intervene quickly and often for students that need in-the-moment support? And are there ways to actually accelerate or push kids deeper into the content? And so again, at Amplify, we're just really proud that our programs that we're producing continue to produce these all green results as EdReports continues to review it. And that's important for probably a few reasons, but a chief reason that materials matter, right? This idea that you have a choice in what you're investing in, And this purchase of instructional materials should be a well thought through investment because, as you can see in this slide, that investment can have an impact as large or larger than the impact of teacher quality. And we've long known the importance of teacher quality. We are just learning that materials can make a difference and make a difference in a big way in classrooms. And we'll come back to this idea to talk about how important strong materials are to support teachers and to support teachers in supporting students. So that's a lot of background, but I think it's important to set the stage as we start to then talk about, okay, how are we at Amplify presenting ELA in a context that really develops students as proficient readers? And we're going to talk first about the research, and then we're going to put this in research in the context of program materials. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is called Scarborough's rope. And it was developed by Hollis Scarborough, who is a researcher into early reading development, primarily as it relates to dyslexia and what we can do to sort of prevent the symptoms of dyslexia. And her idea with this rope was to create for parents a way to understand what students need in their development as they go through their schooling career to really develop as strong, proficient readers. And so you can think of this as the reading proficiency. Sometimes we call it the simple view of reading. Don't mistake the simple view of reading for a process that's easy, because as we know, it's sometimes very difficult to help students learn how to read. So let's talk a little bit about this rope and the different elements of it. You'll see at the top of the rope, we have this thing called language comprehension. And language comprehension can be done in the oral environment or in the written environment. But basically, it's this idea that we need to understand words. We need to have knowledge to understand those words. And when we have both that background knowledge and the associated vocabulary, we can start to look at sentences at a very micro level. We can look at how sentences are put together within paragraphs to start to make some connections and some inferences to come away with the gist. We do the same thing when we're talking about conversations. So in conversations, we use sentences, we use vocabulary, we make connections. All of this is about developing language. And if you continue to interact with talking with folks or reading new things, this language comprehension actually continues to develop for our entire lifetime. So I'm always learning new things. I'm learning new vocabulary associated with those new topics. And so you can kind of think of this language comprehension as an ongoing development process in the way that we learn and grow. The bottom part of this braid is all about word recognition. And this is the idea that we need to be able to decode or unlock the words on the page. This is the idea that we speak words that have sounds, and when we write those words, there's letters or combinations of letters that represent those sounds. And then we put those letters together in words. And so the idea here is that we need to understand phonics and how we represent sounds in patterns so that we can become increasingly automatic in our approach to text. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the science of reading here and why it's so important to get this to kids early in their schooling career. So as we look at this Scarborough's rope from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, you see this idea that early on in students' development, we need to deliver these things in a somewhat discrete way, although never disconnected from the whole. And so you'll see as kids come to us in kindergarten, we need to do some specific instruction in some specific things. And over time in grade 1 and over time in grade 2, these things start to weave together. And about at midpoint, we see where these two strands start to overlap. And you see there, we are becoming then increasingly strategic as we approach text, while at the same time becoming increasingly automatic in our approach to text. This automaticity or fluency, right, that's the goal, so that we can take our cognitive load away from word recognition and actually insert that cognitive energy into more and more language comprehension. Again, as I said, that as students go through their schooling career all the way through high school and into careers and college, and as we continue to grow and develop throughout our lifespan, we put more and more energy into this idea of language comprehension as we continue to interact with text and we continue to develop as readers. So we're going to use this framework quite a bit as we talk through program materials and why they're developed the way that they are. So Amplify CKLA and ELA are actually the only program that's built on Hollis Scarborough's reading rope and built on the structure of this research. Because we don't just focus on knowledge development and we don't just focus on word recognition. We do those two things at the same time early when students come to us in their schooling career, and we continue to grow and develop that over the grades. So what does that look like? What is the experience with ELA when you're using Amplify programs? Well, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about this idea that knowledge matters. And when we talk about knowledge matters, we're going to be talking about that top part of Scarborough's rope, or that language comprehension area. We're going to talk about equity and access. That's where we're going to talk about the access that kids have to unlock that code in print, or the bottom part of that. And we're going to wrap all of that together as we start to talk about engaged learners and what engagement can do for students. And by engagement, I mean really deep and rich engagement in the content itself, and not sort of the bells and whistles that often come with program materials. So let's start a little bit with why knowledge matters. Some of you may be familiar with this research, but this was done in Wisconsin in middle school with middle school students. And the premise behind this research was these two researchers cleared out a classroom and they set up a baseball diamond complete with home base, first base, second base, third base, all the baseball players. And one by one, they brought students in to read a passage and then have them reenact on this baseball diamond what they comprehended from this passage. So we would call this a real life performance assessment. And the readers that they had come in one at a time, obviously some of them were really good readers, some of them couldn't read so well, some of them knew about baseball, and some of them didn't know about baseball. And when I'm in a large group, I'll typically ask everyone, so who do you think performed better on this performance assessment? Those kids that knew a lot about baseball, but weren't that great of readers, or those students that were pretty good readers, but didn't know that much about baseball? And most everybody, every time that I've asked that question, quickly recognize that likely the kids that knew a lot about baseball actually performed better reading this passage and on the performance assessment. And that is absolutely right. Background knowledge matters a whole lot in terms of comprehension. I've done this exercise in professional developments with groups of people where we have brought in a two-page outline or two-page essay, if you will, about string theory. And I've had participants try to identify the main idea and the details in that short article about string theory. And most people can't identify the main idea. So we do a little bit of an intervention with them and give them something simpler to read where they're able to identify the main idea and add some details. And we do it with a second passage just to make sure, right, that we're progress monitoring appropriately. And then we go back to this passage on string theory. Even after that intervention, participants typically aren't able to identify the main idea or details from that article on string theory. So then the next thing we do is I give them another intervention, which is showing them a short YouTube video about the content of what they were reading or the background about what string theory is. And after we do that intervention of giving them background knowledge into the content, most everybody is able to go in and then identify the main idea. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is it's not that it's not important to teach comprehension strategies, but the knowledge that you have when you approach a text or approach a passage will actually take you much further in terms of reading comprehension. Similarly, when you look at images, you bring a lot of background knowledge to identify what the image is attempting to portray. So as you can see in this image from FedEx, you probably already have maybe didn't even think about the background knowledge that you have that helps you understand this. But when I do this again with groups of people, people will forget that, oh yeah, I need to know something about geography, about North America, South America, and there's actually quite a distance between them, and they actually speak two different languages in these two different countries. And so our background knowledge works sort of in tandem, like fluency, right? Like you just bring what you know to passages, and then you're able to comprehend pretty strongly. It's this idea that knowledge builds on knowledge. And what we know about reading comprehension is just this. You approach a text with some sort of background knowledge. As you're reading that text and engaging in that text, you're gaining new background knowledge or new knowledge so that when you leave that text, then you're incorporating that new knowledge with your existing knowledge to build even a broader knowledge base. And Warren Buffett will say this, if you want to know more knowledge, read a bunch of stuff. That's how knowledge works. It actually builds up like compound interest. E.D. Hirsch will also say that it's this kind of well-rounded, knowledge-specific curriculum that will help all students sort of overcome this inequality of opportunity. And one of the things that you'll see is that in CKLA and in Amplify ELA, we're attempting to help students build broad background knowledge and teach them how to use that knowledge in terms of vocabulary development and then in reading comprehension. So what does it look like specifically? Well, in pre-K through 5, we have a lot of broad background knowledge that we cover. And you can see here that what we do is we have a combination of literary texts, we have science topics, we have American history topics, we have world history topics. We take kids from time and place in a great variety, right? Diversity in time and place, diversity in cultures, and just get them exposure to that broad background knowledge. And you'll notice that what we do is we build that intentional sequence both within grades. So for example, in kindergarten, I'm doing a unit or a domain about plants. I'm learning about plants, the roots, the seeds, the stems, all in context of a broader unit. And then the next thing I do is I take all those ideas about plants and I put them in a new related context of farms, where I'm using some of the same vocabulary, but also developing new vocabulary. The same thing happens across the grade levels, where we talk about colonial towns and townspeople, and then frontier explorers and westward expansion, where again, we're building our knowledge over time. Some people will ask about this point in the presentation, well, what happens if a first grader comes to us and they didn't have the pre-K and K knowledge experience? You know, are they going to be not set up, you know, to be strong in terms of comprehending the first grade? And what I say is, you know, it's better if they have more background knowledge, just what we've heard, right? The idea that knowledge builds on knowledge. But it's also okay to start where we're at and start building where we're at. Because what you'll see in the program materials from pre-K all the way through grade 8 is the peer-to-peer interaction that happens in the program materials, as well as how supported the teacher is in setting up these instructional experiences. So what happens then when we get to grades 6, 7, and 8? we continue taking this knowledge that we've developed in the literary environment, in the informational environment as it relates to science and history topics, and we embed kids even further to extend their knowledge into this middle school experience. So knowledge matters. We need to have that to bring to text, to accelerate our comprehension, to help us interact both with reading and with writing. But we also need to have this idea of skills development and equity for all kids as it relates to that development. So let's take some time just to talk a little bit about the importance of foundational skills. And remember, we're talking about that lower portion there of Scarborough's rope or Scarborough's braid. I put this slide up here. If you haven't listened to this podcast called Hard Words, I would really encourage you to do it. It's just a really insightful overview of the challenge we're facing, the challenge kids are facing right now, because our classrooms are not reflecting the science of reading research. And so, again, we know what works in the science of reading. Our classrooms aren't reflecting it, and our program materials aren't supporting that. And many teachers don't even have access to reading science in their undergraduate experience. So I'm not sure how we are expecting teachers to come into the classroom with program materials that don't support reading science and then think that we're going to develop proficient students. So I think we saw in the data at the beginning that we're actually not developing proficient readers, and it's an issue. So please take some time. I think this is the best 55 minutes podcast that I've listened to in a really long time, although I may be biased because this is a topic that's important to me. One of the folks that has been very instrumental in terms of the development of reading science is Dr. Louisa Moats. Again, another resource for you if you are feeling like, I'm not sure that I actually know the science of reading. This is a great book for you to pick up. And it is in here that she will make the call that any child who doesn't learn to read early and well is unlikely to ever flourish. And think about the responsibility we have to the students in our classrooms in kindergarten and first grade and second grade. Research tells us that, if they don't get it in second grade, they're not on track to be good readers. We have many states across the country that have these third grade reading laws so that we can quick get the kids or try to get the kids before they leave us in third grade, knowing that's a significant indicator of their future success in both college and career. For sure, by the time they leave us in 8th grade, that is a critical year. So if we are not doing this development in the pre-K through 8 environment, we're really not doing our job to help students learn what they need to learn. Well, what does this reading science tell us? The reading science tells us that kids, when they first come to us in kindergarten, need strong phonological awareness instruction. And by phonological awareness instruction, I mean the kind of instruction that doesn't necessarily involve words or letters and sounds yet. So phonological awareness instruction is all about helping kids hear sounds, hear patterns of sounds, and then recreate these patterns of sounds. And this is important because what we have to do is, in the decoding process or unlocking this code process, we have to understand that our words are made up of series of sounds. We also have to understand that sentences are made up of series of words. And so by helping our students actually gain that strong foundation and phonological awareness first, we give kids a head start. If there's anybody that's listening to this podcast that is a speech language pathologist, you're probably clapping your hands right now, because one of the things that kids get referred to for special ed most is this idea of phonological awareness, right? It's missing. So rather than waiting for them to not get it, what we're going to do is we're going to give this prerequisite reading and writing instruction before we even move them in to understanding what that looks like in terms of sounds and words. The first 2 units in our program do this in kindergarten, unlike any other program. So we actually don't start with a letter of the day. We give kids this strong phonological awareness base and then move them into phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is the kind of instruction you do with the lights off, so that kids can break apart sounds of words and put words back together, so that when we start teaching them the code, they have then the background knowledge necessary to help them become strong decoders. So we teach all of the basic code and we teach all of the advanced code. I'm not going to go too much more into the details of this, but it's based on a very explicit scope and sequence of very systematic scope and sequence of very explicit instruction, much like the research recommends. It looks a little bit like this. So our reading instruction will help kids hear the sound. They'll learn how to write or represent that sound, and immediately they're going to go into a reader where they're going to practice reading that sound over and over and over again. We're going to over practice those skills so that they can generalize them to any text, much like the best batters in the world take batting practice every single day to make them successful in future contexts. When we get to grades 3, 4, and 5, we're then bringing those kids back into text that's strong in content as we start to further develop their reading and writing connection in terms of response to text, and just building then those strong core skills that they need to have to develop as strong readers. We make then a really tight connection between reading and writing. I love this example from one of our 5th grade units. It's the last 5th grade unit that we have, where students are presented with a text that's not quite narrative and not quite informational, and the very first activity they have to do is find evidence of the text where they think this text should be classified as narrative or should it be classified as informational. And then they immediately apply that to say, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at that model and we're going to actually then write a narrative that has some informational content. So you can imagine if we're doing this at the end of 5th grade, we've already done the prerequisite work to help develop students with things like understanding the different text types, how to write in those text types, how to recognize elements and text features that help communicate those text types. And then we continue that into 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, where students are going to take a more active role in critical thinking as they start to analyze text in a really, really close way. So even more emphasis on close reading, all allowing all students to have access to that same text. So in both Amplify CKLA and Amplify ELA, what you will find is all students will have access to the same grade level text, but you will get instructional scaffolds and instructional supports to help you understand how to bring students up to the level of that access. And so I think this is the thing that I am most excited about in our program, is that we actually believe that all students can learn, and we believe all students should have the right to learn at high levels of rigor and high levels of instruction. And we treat all students with just very respectful learning experiences. So we've talked a little bit about why knowledge matters, why having that background knowledge will help you close the gap in comprehension. This idea that background knowledge is a key element as we start to engage with text. And our program materials actually don't ever assume that kids have that background knowledge. We explicitly develop it through our program so all students are on the same page. We've also talked about the importance of building students' decoding ability to ensure they are able to access grade level text, and then continuing to sort of push them in that text complexity of giving them the instructional supports each student needs to help them be successful with that content. So let's talk last just about this idea then of engaged learners. Wow, we're really in an attention crisis these days, right? We are so overwhelmed with things that call for our attention. And think about this as an adult, right? I can look at my iPhone right now and I can tell you how often I've interacted with my iPhone and for what purposes. We're seeing research come out saying that, you know what? We think we're good at multitasking, but we're actually not good at multitasking at all. If you really want to be successful in a task, you need to concentrate on that task at hand. And so it's really becoming an issue. I mean, just look at this data on social media and digital device use from 2012 to 2018. How many people have their own smartphone and how many people use social media multiple times a day? And again, if you have an iPhone and you haven't looked at how often you're using your social media or using your iPhone, it will give you a report and it will probably shock you. I mean, I know my daughter is having this conversation with my granddaughter right now, who's in 4th grade, and who says, why can't I have a smartphone? Because my friends have a smartphone too. So we're really doing a lot of competing in terms of attention with kids at a younger and younger age. So how then do we tap into this idea of engagement? Well, remember those topics that we saw, right? Those broad topics across literature and the arts and science and social studies, going all the way from pre-K all the way up through 8th grade. And what we find in our program is that students get really excited about these topics because it makes them feel respected in the learning environment, right? They feel like scientists, they feel like historians, they feel like they can talk about and add ideas and information into this content because we're allowing them to have access to that. I'm going to show you a series of tweets. So we have, if you're a Twitter user, I encourage you to search on hashtag CKLA. And this was really a grassroots sort of movement from some of the teachers of our program, and it's gaining more and more momentum. It's really fun to go on a daily basis and find out what's happening in CKLA classrooms across the United States. But we see then teachers showing us various levels of depth of knowledge along with just various ideas of how students are using this content. And so this one teacher says, I love their ability to recall information from our lessons. And what we want to remember is that even though it feels like, oh, that's a low DOK, it's low on the blooms, you know, recalling information, is that such a great thing? And I will say, yes, it actually is. Because remember the idea that knowledge builds on knowledge? If you don't know something about something, you can't build knowledge on that something. So this is part of what we do, and you know, kids are starting at an early age. This is kindergarten to start learning about presidency and about founding fathers. This is an example of a 3rd grade unit. It's the Vikings unit. This teacher actually teaches multiple sections of 3rd grade, and she says here, my 2nd class read the 2nd chapter of the Vikings unit. Most of them do not agree with Odin forgiving Loki. I was just doing this session and I said, who knows what this teacher is talking about? And many people don't know, and you wouldn't know unless you knew sort of this Odin and Loki, right? These fables and from the Vikings, and that's what this reader is all about. But now they're engaging in this text by talking about point of view and distinguishing their own point of view from that of the characters. This is another level in depth of knowledge. So, right, you have to have knowledge to be able to work with and do your own point of view as it relates to depth of knowledge. And then we have a 2nd grade example of students working on a culminating activity for the westward expansion. And what they're doing now is they're taking the information that they learned. You can see in some of these examples, they were using graphic organizers to help them with that. And now they're actually putting pencil to paper and doing some informational writing around these ideas that they were developing in this knowledge strand. When kids then move into middle school, right, they get more and more engaged with this content, and teachers become more and more engaged as they're starting to see students energized and developed. And we then help students really get into text, do really close reading of text, help scaffold their understanding and learning so that they now are exploring topics worth knowing and they're reading texts worth reading. The idea here is that over and over and over again, we're hearing stories from the field where students are talking about these topics outside of the ELA block. They're talking about them at lunchtime. They're going to the library to check out books purposefully that extend this idea of topics. They take these things home and talk to their parents about them, who then come back to the school and say, wow, what are you teaching our kids here? Because all of a sudden they know more than we know about Edgar Allan Poe or about the Romans. And they're wanting to engage in research beyond the classroom to learn even more. And so this idea of engagement in the classroom happens again, not because of the bells and whistles that we pull into the program, but with the idea that kids want to know something, and we're using that idea of knowledge in the ELA or literacy environment to really launch them into becoming better readers and writers. So let's go back to this teacher in the classroom. This teacher in the classroom who didn't get what he or she needed in the undergraduate program, even maybe if they went to be a reading specialist, may still not have gotten the information that they needed to have as it relates to decoding, or the information that knowledge builds on knowledge, and that it's an important element into the classroom. And too often, I think we're quick to want to blame teachers, but it's really not their fault. And this is why it is so important to have strong instructional materials in the hands of teachers and wrap that around with professional development and support that helps them both understand and grow in the reading science research, with program materials that can support them tomorrow. And that's why we're just so proud of being top rated by EdReports, because both Amplify CKLA and Amplify ELA do just that, right? They're strong program materials that reflect the reading research, and they support teachers in being able to implement that immediately into the classroom. You know, again, going back to, it's not teachers' fault that they don't know the science of reading research. And what we want to do is encourage them to know better so that they can then go into the classroom and do better. And again, our program materials really help teachers understand how to do that, to point to the places that really make an impact, to try to move that needle or that trajectory so that we don't have 37% of our students graduating and not becoming proficient readers. So I'm going to stop with that and see what questions that we've had that have sort of emerged throughout this webinar.
Okay, so just a reminder, if you have any questions as we're answering this first one, don't hesitate to ask it in the little questions section. Susan, our first question comes from Sarah. They ask, how do we differentiate for all students and then specifically for special education students while still exposing students to grade level content?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I'm going to give you an example of some of the ways that we can do that. So I think when we think of the word differentiation, we naturally think different activities, right? So students maybe that are that need a little extra support, need to have a different kind of experience with the text than somebody that is at or above grade level. And what I'll say is that one way, and this is a strategy you can employ tomorrow in your classroom if you want to, is it's the idea of those open-ended activities that help naturally differentiate themselves for students where they can come into either a text or an activity. The middle school ELA talks about this really well. We talk about low floors and high ceilings. And what we mean by that is to scaffold that instruction back for all students to start asking the kind of questions that students can engage with, and then develop and ask them broader and broader and broader and deeper questions to be able to help them move from what they don't know to what they do know. I'm going to make two more comments with that. First of all, what we know is that when we have background knowledge of something, or when we have knowledge of something and the vocabulary associated with it, we are better able to interact with both reading and writing. Remember the baseball study, right? So as we're coherently developing students' background knowledge, we're giving them an advantage already to be able to interact with text and with writing in ways they couldn't do that before. The second thing is that when we come to this sort of low floors, high ceilings approach, we also not just benefit, just doesn't just benefit those kids that need the low entry point, it actually benefits those kids that are thinking on higher levels. Because what often happens is students that are thinking on higher levels aren't often able to articulate or break apart and get to the component parts of information. And so we actually help both students become deeper in their thinking and more articulate in terms of their approach to writing. When it comes to students that have specific special needs, and those are those students that are on IEPs and receiving specific services, that's where our program materials can also support, because you can look at what the student needs, and in CKLA, you actually can go to what we call an assessment and remediation guide to help start where students are at when it comes to the decoding and encoding process. In our middle school programs, the students will actually be given a level based on where the teacher assigns them, so they will have that natural scaffolding built into the program as well. And so all of that is at point of use for teachers, so they can actually understand then how to bring their students into that fold of accessing grade level text.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. So our next question is from Corey, and Corey asks, what are some supports that CKLA and Amplify ELA offer for EL students?
That's a really good question as well. So CKLA actually offers a couple of things as well as middle school ELA. So first of all, both programs have what we call in-the-moment program supports. And these program supports appear in sidebars. In middle school ELA, they're right in the materials as well, to help those L students engage in the grade level content, right? So we want to scaffold and help all L students be able to access that grade level content. We also have a designated ELD program. And what that means is that's a time for students to actually have additional instruction that supports language development focused on those L standards. So the way that it works is a little bit like this. An L student would be in the core instruction, and let's just use CKLA for an example. So they would be in their grade 3 core content or primary instruction, where the teacher is giving them additional supports to help them access that content. They would then leave to go have maybe 30 to 45 minutes of extra instruction as a designated time, using the one-to-one lesson correspondence with program materials in that designated ELD time that actually focuses more on language development. So they're not doing a separate program for K through 8, they're doing an extension of the program that was in the core classroom. And we've seen the implementation for that work in a couple of ways. Sometimes people do pull kids out to have that designated ELD time. Sometimes they get push-in services that actually help them right there in the classroom.
Awesome. So we actually have another question from Sarah, and Sarah asks, do you find that it benefits students to teach outside of the grade level, above or below grade, to push the students?
So if we're talking about in terms of acceleration, my bent is is always no. And let me tell you a little bit more about that. We get this question a lot about what happens if my kindergarten student comes to school and already knows how to read. So let me use that as an example first. And what I say is that it is rare, it happens sometimes, but it is extremely rare that a child can pick up all 44 sound spelling patterns on their own. And so when kids come to us in kindergarten and seem like they're readers, they're probably really good memorizers. And unless they had a mom or grandma or caregiver at home that was actually explicitly teaching them all those 44 sound spelling patterns, again, they're probably really good memorizers. Will they know some of the sounds? Yeah, they will, but they probably won't know all of them. And so it's really important for us to give that explicit instruction for them on the same sort of systematic approach we do all students, or they hit what we call as a glass ceiling, right? They'll get to third grade and people will say, well, they seem like they were really good readers and I don't know what happened. Now they're not doing so well. A lot of times that's because they haven't been taught the code. And so we have to make sure they learn that. On the knowledge side of the house, when we talk about interacting with content, we get this question often as well. And what implementations find out right away is because the knowledge is so rich, the topics are so rich and inspiring from kindergarten all the way through grade 8, that students naturally seek out new opportunities. And so it's so much better to help them go deep in the content with additional reading related to the topic or additional writing related to the topic rather than having them move through faster. You will also notice in our programs that we have additional libraries available where kids can go out and explore more on their own. Or they can, like I said, just get to their library, the school library or even their public library to just extend. But we don't see that to be an issue, that the topics just naturally help students just get more and more involved in reading and writing.
Okay, Susan, it looks like we have 2 more questions that hopefully we can get through. So the next question is from Marissa, and Marissa asks, what kinds of professional learning supports are available for those new to the program?
It's a great question, and there are a variety. So let's talk about the program materials themselves in pre-K all the way through grade 8 are really good about orienting the teacher to what you are doing in that unit and why you're doing it. So the unit introductions will give teachers lots of background knowledge on that unit, what's happening within that unit, and why you're doing it. So for example, why are you teaching this sound spelling code in the way that you're teaching it? The program materials will also include appendix documents in the back that really talk about the science of reading or really talk about, let's say, why westward expansion is an important topic for students to learn. So that's right within the program materials. We also have on our resource site professional learning modules available where teachers can do that individually or teachers can do that in professional learning communities. Basically watch a video, learn something about the program materials and the why behind it, and be able to share as a learning community. When it comes to the professional development and training side of the house, as we know and love it, of course you get upfront training for all of the programs, but depending on the needs of the implementation, we do lots and lots of customization to wrap those services around on an ongoing basis to ensure you're getting the support that you need. Some examples of this, I was just recently in Erie, Pennsylvania, who purchased the entire program. They wanted to roll it out early. They're going to be implementing it in the fall. And they took one of their professional development days, and I was there to do a kickoff with all of the teachers about what's the reading science, how this program is built on the reading science. And then they did breakout sessions to do a pre-training prior to the training as part of the change management process. We have other places where we'll do the 2 days of training up front, and then we come back and we do classroom observations and walk through and see how things are going. We help the leadership understand look-fors and how to coach the teachers in the classroom. And so really our PD is wraparound and totally customized to how you want your implementation. I mean, just one more comment with that. We know you can have the best program in the world, all green on EdReports, but if we don't also provide that professional development for teachers, we don't move the needle as much as we could.
All right, so our next question is the view of CKLA to teach all the students the exact same lesson in the skills part of the program, even though students are way above grade level reading fluently? Example, first grade.
Okay, that's a good question. And again, what I would say is the program is built on, and when we're talking about K1 and 2 in the science of reading, the program is built on the idea that most students actually don't understand it, and most students actually need that explicit instruction and practice. Our skills strand is doing that learning to read, where it's also doing the learning to write. So you'll have some learning to write in that part of the program too. What we do have in our program materials is a few assessment opportunities to help you determine what students know and what students may need. And so the way that it works is that there's a beginning, a middle, and end of year assessment, along with how to analyze that assessment to try to find gaps in students' learning. And when you understand those gaps, you can do one level of intervention. Our program materials are also built such that every single day, the teacher will have clarity about what students should know and be able to do by the end of that lesson, as well as formative assessments to understand how well students have learned that. And what's important about that is it allows a teacher to make immediate adjustments in the instruction or see that students actually are getting it, and we may need to do some customization for that student. I have seen classrooms implement CKLA, even though it's written in more of a whole group, although we do lots of small groups too. You can deliver that instruction in different ways. So let's say you have a group of students that you know always picks up the sound spelling patterns really quickly. You can work with that group of students in a small group, teach that group of students, have them launched into another reading and writing activity while you're taking another small group and delivering instruction to them in a different way. And I just observed this in a big implementation here in Northern Michigan, where a kindergarten teacher did every single one of her skills lessons in a small group rotation, giving students then extra practice where they need extra practice, but then allowing her students some extension where they need extension, not further into the program, but all deepening their knowledge around one of those primary focus objectives that are listed in the program materials.
Okay, Susan, I think we have time for this one last question. And of course, if you have additional questions and they were not answered during this webinar, I believe Susan will have contact information where you can reach out to us and we would gladly answer your questions. So this last question is, what about ability grouping? Have you seen schools ability group?
Yes, and I think it depends on the needs of your building and what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm assuming we're talking about this in relation to students acquiring the code. And the program materials and the professional development will help you understand how to use that to help students. Again, for the needs of your school and in your specific implementation, we can certainly help you do that.
Okay, awesome.
So thank you all for joining, and we'll take some of that information out of the chat box, but please feel free to reach out and contact us. Follow us on Facebook at Amplify Education. Get on our website at amplify.com. There is an 800 number that you can reach out for additional support if you want to see samples or if you have more questions. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I hope that you learned something new about Amplify, Amplify CKLA, Amplify ELA, and importantly, something new about the science of reading. Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a great evening. The recording for this webinar will be available.